last year we had a certain Gary Pickles, who we managed to Velcro to a chair off the trail and have him do a little bit of talk about how his work and what he's doing and all that sort of stuff. Tell you how difficult that is. It's very difficult, and it's taken us a lot of time to get him back this year because his talk last year went down so well. So we've got some new Velcro, extra strong this time. We've Velcroed him to a chair, and we've going to ask him to give us a whistle-stop tour along the trail and talk about how things have been during the course of, what can I say? It's been a dramatic year, hasn't it, Gary?
It's been very traumatic in sections.
Yeah, definitely. So, Gaza, when you're ready, do you want to share your screen and take us on a journey?
Will do.
Right, I've got that, Gary, so you're looking good to go.
Excellent. Well, hello again. I did think before we got into today's talk, it might be useful for me to talk a little bit about who I am, what I do, and where I do it. Because some people may have witnessed the talk I did before, but some of you may be coming to this anew. So this is me. I am, to give me my full job title, the Hadrian's Wall Path National Trail Maintenance Ranger. And it's my responsibility to look after the surface of the footpath, to make sure that all the gates open and close and all the signs point in the right direction. Additionally, the Hadrian's Wall path runs upon a scheduled ancient monument, so it's also my responsibility to ensure that the usage of the footpath doesn't have a negative effect upon the underlying archaeology. Today's talk, once we get to that, will be about how other organisations who do work within the area, within the World Heritage Site, we're on the path, but that we don't actually contribute to, can have a benefit. So these in some ways can be the unsung heroes of the path. So firstly, we really need to establish what is a footpath, because that's predominantly what I look after. And a footpath as we know it is owing its origins to the National Parks and Access Countryside Act 1949, which creates a definitive map. And this shows where all the rights of way, the footpaths, the bridleways, the cycleways are that cover the countryside. Now, the National Trail is like a higher level version of a footpath, and it doesn't use a footpath, it uses a multitude of this network to take you from A to B, and that's what we're looking after. And as I mentioned earlier, the Hadrian's Wall path runs alongside the scheduled ancient monument, so we've got that added level. The point I would be making here in this iconic thing is the footpath runs along the side of the wall. It doesn't run along the other side of the wall, and it doesn't run along the bottom of the valley. It runs along there. So where you have archaeology and access, you get conflict, and my job's to try and mitigate as best as possible for that. So this is the Hadrian's Wall National Trail. Is sort of where we'll begin. Travel all through the national park, drop down into Cumbria, through Carlisle, and we'll end up in Bowness. And then for those who press too much, that is overlaying the rights of way. So within the city council, we don't manage the rights of way because it's a very urban environment. That's why the footpaths aren't there. And in Cumbria, they only gave me their footpaths along the corridor of the Hadrian's Wall, whereas Northumberland gave me all of it. So all these are individual footpaths. They all have an individual name and they all have an individual location. And we use part of this network to get from A to B. So as I've spoken, what we want to do is we want to manage the footpath in such a way that doesn't affect the monument. And so what we want is to create something that is usable. You've got to be able to walk along the footpath. Sorry. It's got to be sustainable, as in it's got to be able to cope with the level of usage. And it's got to be sympathetic to the landscape. So in this example, we're in the countryside. This is an arable field. It's a countryside margin, and it's all green and it's lush. So it's quite a perfect scenario. If we were to transport this to Newcastle, then it would cease to be usable very quickly, and therefore it's not sustainable and it wouldn't look right. So vice versa, if we brought the urban area from Newcastle into the city, it would be usable, it would be sustainable, but it wouldn't be sympathetic. So the point I try to make is, in trying to achieve all our goals, we need to understand that no one surface is perfect for all of them. And then just to take the whole cross section, if you think we can start in the tidal flats around Carlisle, where we have common grazing, we come into the urban areas of Carlisle before we come up into the lowland pastures. By pastures, I mean land with grazing animals. Upland pastures for the windsill, the central section, are say grazing animals, but the soils are much thinner, so it's harder to maintain a good surface. Then we'll drop down to the lowland arable, which is wheat, barley, things like that, and the path tends to run along the field margins before we end up back into Newcastle. As I say, we want to create grassland as the wearing membrane, and that benefits from sunshine. So where the path has a southern aspect, it is easier to maintain than when it has a northern aspect. And then the final thing to take into consideration with all these different surfaces is where the honeypots are, where the areas that are going to draw the most attention, because they are going to have a higher level of usage. So you can have two places of identical location, but if one's got a Roman fort on it, it's got a much more increased user level, and therefore the path may cut up. Whereas a little bit to the east, there's no sort of iconic views, and therefore the people don't go there as much, so it's easier to manage. So there is no one simple solution. We try and manage lots of solutions all the way through it. And that is a brief overview of the National Trail. So we're going to start our physical journey. What I thought we'd look at is all the things that happen along the trail that we don't directly input onto, but we can work with. So we're going to start at the beginning at Wallsend, and I'm going to use Wallsend as an example for the passport scheme. I know I've spoken a little bit now about how we want to manage the conflict between access and archaeology. We can't stop the access because you have a right of way, and we can't change the designation because it is what it is. So what we can do is try and incentivize people to come in the drier periods of the year. So for instance, this passport scheme runs from Easter to the end of October. You can collect a passport from Segedunum, and then you get stamps along the way. So you've got Sege, Chester's, Robin Hood, get to Housestead, Bird-Oswald, the Sand Centre, and then I think Bowness at the end. Once you've got to the end, you can get yourself a little certificate and you can get yourself a badge. It has proved hugely successful and actually generates quite a significant amount of income for us. So if we're to look at Segedunum and the beginning, in the year, I'm going to use the most accursed of excuses, COVID. But in the year prior to COVID, we earned £14,000 from the passport scheme. Now, this is a significant amount of money because we can use it to apply for grants. And if you were to apply for a grant for something, they usually stipulate some sort of match funding, 25%, 50%, etc. So the 10 grand in COVID year that we lost, because we only generated £4,000, could actually have been used for grants to pull down a significant amount like 40,000. So it's something that happened, something that was unforeseen, but the repercussions can actually be quite significant. Luckily for us, looking into this year to date, we're up to 17,000. So you could make the argument that some of the money that we would have lost last year, people have now coming back into it. But it's just to highlight something that nobody could have foreseen, nobody could have planned, but it does have an effect upon us. Moving on from Wallsend, what we tend to do is follow the cycleway, I think it's number 72, travel all the way through Newcastle until we get to the Wagon Way, about here. Now this is the Wagon Way. It is, I think it's about 1750. This was the route that the coal would have been brought down from the Wylam collieries down onto the docks. Eventually, I think Puffin Billy actually ran up and down here. And then in about 1972, perhaps, all the rails were changed and it became a cycleway. And then when the trail was put in, we used this section to get us from Newburn up to Close House and then Headon. It is a hugely used route from cyclists to dog walkers, joggers, and all the people on the National Trail. And the problem we have is that we have trees to either side. And if we have trees to either side, we have roots to either side, and the roots just begin nibbling and nibbling and nibbling away at the edges, and the path itself gets narrower and narrower. So Sustons, who managed the National Cycle Route, applied to a grant with the government, and this was for about 300,000, and the path runs along 60% of it. So this can be viewed as an income, roughly about 185,000 being spent on the National Trail that we didn't have to contribute to. And what you get is this lovely blacktop surface. Now, bear this blacktop surface in mind because we're going to revisit it a couple of times as we journey along. But it's just to demonstrate this was Northumberland County organised the work. It was all undertaken. It was paid through sustenance and the government, but we directly benefit it because it's an improvement to the National Trail. So we'll come out, if I get my icon, from Close House, climb up into Heddon, go over the 69, round Ironside, up over past Albemarle, Whittle Dean, and eventually we're going to get to Wall Houses. So this is another example of working with our organisations. The Mapthon Estate own the Wall Houses, and the path originally would have emerged onto the road here. You'd have walked in front of the farmsteading, and then you'd have got back on the path there. If people know this route, it's a very fast-moving road and there is no pavement, so it was deemed a very dangerous section to have. And after a couple of years, the estate was approached to see whether they would be able to do something to simplify the danger. What they came up with isn't ideal, because what they did is they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kissing gates were put to get yourself around this short section. And basically it was to minimise the risk to walkers with the livestock in the various fields. So if I was to replace any one of these kissing gates, it would probably cost £400 to get a contractor in and supply the materials. So in this small section, we have a cost or an asset of £4,000. And it's also quite a complicated asset because of all the kissing gates. They're just a little bit awkward. And they're the original smaller scale kissing gate, which can be quite difficult if you've got yourself a rucksack and things. So I work very closely with a lot of the farmers and the estate. And when I heard that Alistair here was retiring, we approached the estate to see whether once he'd retired and before the new tenant came in, we'd have the opportunity to sort of simplify this whole structure. And I have to say the estate were brilliant about it. They just asked for us to wait until they actually got the new tenant in. And then once they had the tenant in, they would then understand the tenant's needs. And the tenants were going to run horse livery. So these fields here and here would be theirs. This field in section would be taken back to the estate and would become arable. So these 2 kissing gates disappeared. And then the fenced off corridor here and a small section here, we managed to get rid of these 2 kissing gates as well. So that's £1,600 taken off our liability, which is a huge improvement. And if you want to be able to visualise this, this is what it looks like. So this is a little bit of the cradle that was left. It would have emerged out here, ran back there, and the gate would have been hung on here. And the other cradle, there's my acorn, would have been in this sort of section. And basically they wanted fenced corridors to keep people away from the livestock. So approaching them, we asked if we'd be able to do something, which basically would allow us to do that. So that's 2 kissing gates, that's £800 just removed. Now, this kissing gate is still waiting for the moment because we didn't have one that would open the right way, but you can see in the distance, the metal kissing gates there. Now, the reason we chose metal kissing gate, or just wicket gates, is that if you've got horses in here, horses tend to nibble on timber, and so we didn't want to put a lot of new gates in and then have horses chew away at them. The Northumberland County Council supplied the gates and the materials, and these, from the first point we came to, are out of the monument, so all these structures didn't need an SMC, which was why we were allowed to be able to change them. So just a little glimpse again. Now, just after we'd done all this work, I think it was something like we finished on a Wednesday and Storm Arwen appeared on the weekend, and this is what happened. So that gate barely lasted 3 days before this massive piece of ash jumped off the tree that's just to one side and landed there. I do tend to daydream quite a lot when I'm at work, and that's what I saw when I turned up. I thought it was a better image. Now, this doesn't directly affect the estate, the footpath, but it does show the estate looking at the whole picture as well. So they've also worked with Natural England through their countryside stewardship schemes, and the Forestry Commission, guided by Historic England, have put money available to remove timber off the monument. So the wall runs along the side of the road there and then disappears up there. That is going towards the Errington Arms. And this is what they've done. So all these trees that were growing on the monument have been felled through the stewardship and working with the Forestry Commission. And ultimately, it's taking rooting plants off the monument. So although the path doesn't run that way, it's just demonstrating what other people are doing along the trail that benefits the monument. So moving on from Wall Houses and passing up there, we'll reach Stanley Plantation and revisit Storm Arwen. So this is what it looks like now. A significant amount of timber fell over. And the problem with Storm Arwen is that it came from the wrong direction. So if you can all imagine yourselves standing on the seafront or something with a bracing wind, and how you push yourself into that wind so that you manage to stay upright, that's what trees tend to do. They lean into the normal area of the wind. So these trees would all usually be leaning slightly southwesterly, and the wind came from the completely opposite direction. So if we go back to the analogy earlier on, if you're leaning in as a tree to brace yourself against the wind, imagine that wind disappearing and appearing behind you, you'd just fall flat on your face. And this is literally what's happened here. So all the trees have started to fall over. And when one of them goes, it pushes the wind into the plantation. And then the next one goes, and then the next one goes. And that's how we kind of get the domino effect. So these root plates are 10 foot tall. There's probably 2 or 3 ton here. And then all the footpath has to be is felled, drop all this lot, the path open again to usage. All these root plates will drop back down into the holes that they've come from. And you could argue that the path is available once more, but these holes will just over a period of time fill with water, and then that water will spread and spread and spread, and the problem won't go away. But what can you actually do? Because there's probably hundreds of trees on this section that have fallen over, and if only one root plate weighed 1 ton, there's 100 ton of material that needs removing off site. Luckily, we're going to work with the Stagshaw Estate, and I think I'm meeting them on Friday, and Natural England and Historic England, to look at what we can actually do to take this forward. So the path is diverted way up here, and it will bring us up around the edges and into there. So that's what Storm Arwen did, something completely unexpected, but presents ourselves with quite a significant challenge. And if you think we maybe have money available through grants, and then you can go back to the COVID example and the 10 grand that we could have got, you can see how things can domino with us. This is talking about individual farmers, St Oswald's Farm. So we're going to move away from wall houses, dropping down towards Chollerford, and we reach St Oswald's Farm. Same sort of thing that I've spoke to you before about. All the gorse that grew up over here would have dropped down into the north ditch, it would have emerged onto the side, and then it would have started pushing people further and further over here. So what we did is we felled all the gorse that was on the footpath, and then in the following years, I felled all the stuff that was here. John, through his countryside stewardship scheme, got permission to remove all the gorse off here. So all these blackened areas were where the bushes would have been. And then there would have been some stump treatment to stop the regeneration coming back. And again, it's not directly affecting us, but given sufficient time, if he didn't do it, the gorse that is there would have crept back down the ditch and back up on the monument, and then I would having to do some more work. So it's really good that John's done all that work on his own back. Now, I talk a little bit about other organisations, farmers. This one is something that the parks themselves have taken on board. So the Landscape Enhancement Initiative, or I'll briefly call it the LER, is around Craglough, if we know the central section of the trail, and is proposed to redress the surfaces through the woods from Sycamore Gap to Milking Gap, and also do something from Cat Stairs going towards Sycamore Gap. But again, Storm Arwen had other things taken into consideration. So the Landscape Enhancement Initiative is funded through Ofgem, the Office of Gas and Electric Markets, and due to the landscape impact of their pylons, they've made money available to enhance the landscape. Their stipulation is a 25%, and this overall project, which we're working with the National Trust, comes in at 150,000. So just to make sums easier, let's pretend it's 160,000. That means that we need to supply 40,000 of our money to match fund it and draw down the other amount. So you can see how that 10,000 grand would have been quite useful at this period. And this is unfortunately what it looks like. Again, the wood came from the wrong side, so all the trees have fallen, the domino effect has happened, and now we're going to have to wait for the National Trust to come in and remove all the pieces of timber from here before we can actually get back in and redress the surface. So this work was all ready to go this year, but unfortunately things happen beyond our control. The second aspect of what we were looking at is, if you remember the talk from earlier, here's the Kissing Gate down at the bottom. This is the one where we got flags in and redressed the surface, and you can sort of see there's a lovely section of wall there, probably got a couple of courses, and it runs up there. And you can see that people are congregating there. They've actually decided to start pushing over there before getting back on top of it. Now, this needs redressing with a soil aggregate mix to make it sustainable again. But what happens is, because it's quite a thin, this is bedrock here, the soil, if we put it in, tends to just run to the bottom with rain and usage. So firstly, we need to create a series of dams or big steps, and then with those steps we can put in the soil and the aggregate mix behind it, and so everything here is retained by that, everything here is retained by that, etc, etc. So this is also being funded through the LER, and although it isn't being affected with the timber from Storm Arwen, once everybody comes on site, it's much easier to get all the work done. So this work is also being delayed. Now we move quite a long way, so we get down to about Coalfields, travel up through Copmount Hill, drop down into Walltown, past Gilsland, all the way through until we reach Port Broom, where we'll visit a bigger storm, Storm Desmond, which I think was in about 2015. It's just on the outskirts of Carlisle, and this is what it did. If we go back to the very beginning of the talk, a footpath is where the footpath is. So naturally here you would think the footpath runs along the side of it, but the footpath actually runs directly here, and a huge chunk of it just got ripped out by the storm. And this again is a flood defence. So luckily for us, money was made available through the government to renew the flood defences, and a lot of this work was undertaken through Cumbria, and today it's costed about 150 grand. None of which we have paid for, but because we were about at the time, we managed to benefit on it by having a better surface for the trail put in place. So my angle's not quite right on here, but if you look at that little cleft there, it's the same as that little cleft there. Now, when you look at it like that, you think, oh, that looks a lot better, but you don't actually realise the amount of work that's gone on in between. So this is just a brief demonstration of how big the actual works were to take in. So you've got all these posts which are driven into the ground to stop the land being able to be eroded by the river. You build it up and up and up, and then eventually you dress it, and then you plant willow on top of it to stop it going away. And we got an ideal surface put on top of it. And this was just with working with Cumbria County Council, when the work was being discussed, having a voice that could say, and the National Trail runs along the top of it, so we need to make sure we've got an adequate surface. So huge benefit. And now all the things I've spoken about with Storm Arwen have been negative. We're talking about Storm Desmond, and we're talking about it in a positive manner. All we need is time. So moving away from Storm Arwen, Desmond, we can travel into the cycle way at Rickaby, and we can revisit the blacktop that we looked on the Wile and Wagon way. So this, again, was a flood defence that was put into place. I have to try and pause this. So what the Environment Agency did is, oh, I know I'm doing wrong. Just pause a little bit. They wanted to create a bigger, more substantial flood defence. So this gap here in the vegetation is where the old road would have went, and they've moved everything to the right, built the flood defence, and one of the things they had to do, because the National Trail run along this section, was to build a new section of blacktop for us. So this is what we ended up with. Again, you've got a better usage, it's better defined, it's got the fence, so it works, but didn't cost us anything. We'll revisit Desmond again, I think, very soon. The Swifts is a section that runs from the Memorial Bridge in Carlisle towards where the Sand Centre is, and they've proposed the same sort of work to be undertaken. Another surface is going to be created. This is it currently, and what you can see from here is it just gets cut up quite quickly. A lot of the vegetation from the right comes in, and this is the golf course in Carlisle, so you're sort of trapped between two places. Not a very good thing. So hopefully in the next couple of years this will all be redressed in blacktop. And then the West Coast main line is the main route into Scotland. And when Storm Desmond happened, there was a huge amount of damage. It took a couple of years for the footpath to be reinstated, but it did allow us, with the level of work that was undertaken, to improve the actual routes through this section. So this is what it looked like. This is the West Coast main line above us. These are some of the main electric cables feeding Carlisle. And if I was to zoom in just a little bit, there's my finger post. So this is a Victorian flood defence, if I can kind of go backwards. It was all rebuilt, and then the weight of water with trees that came up against the edge of the bridge got so much that it just literally blew this section away. So massive amount of work, but ultimately, looking the other way, you can see the damage and then you can see the improvement. So this is, again, working with organisations that need to do something within the infrastructure that you can indirectly benefit from. And I think this may be the final option that we have. Moving out of Carlisle, we can sort of travel all the way along to Bowness, but coming online in the next few years is the English Coastal Path. And in this section here, will run parallel with the Hadrian's Wall Trail in certain sections. So the English Coastal Path will run along here, but then probably take this section. We will run similar here, but then the path will follow the coast route, pick up the trail again along here, but that one will move north. And then we'll run in, connect to the bridge. And then once it's got over the bridge here, it will then run back up there, back over the river and carry on all its way. The benefit of this is when you're installing or creating something, you have more funds available. So the areas where our paths run parallel, we have the option for improvements, and the improvements can be done through the English Coastal Path. So we can work with these to try and benefit the trail at some point. And then ultimately, we'll have a better trail or two better trails. And then we finish our journey in Bowness. And this is, as we would call, these two ladies, when I turned up, they were going to walk back to Carlisle. And once they'd done that section, they would have walked every section of every national trail. So if I could speak to them now, I'd be able to ask them, are you going to do English Coastal Path? Because that one would now be outstanding. And I believe that's me walking away. So that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that whistle-stop tour along the National Trail. I've got to say, a real practical nuts and bolts vision of what the trail looks like and how it works. I'm sure there's a round of applause out there from the audience. I don't know whether you want to do it really or virtually, but clap away, people. Right, I am sure that there's going to be questions for you, Gary, but what we'll do first is we'll deal with the questions that are in the chat. Let's have a look. And it's Bill. Bill's got in with lots of questions early on. I saw them pop up, Bill, when you were talking about the German cycleway and so forth. Do you want to elaborate on those comments that you made in there, Bill?
Yes, I think I only sent them to you actually, rather than the rest of the group, so they probably can't see them. I was just saying,
sorry.
Yeah, I'd mentioned, was it yesterday, that I'd cycled down the Limmies in 2018, and as you just cycled Hadrian Cycleway, which I've done as well in the past, I thought you might have been interested. And there is actually a guide to it in Dutch that covers that in 3 volumes all the way down to the Black Sea.
And equally the German Limes Radweg.
Yeah, the German Limes bit, there's a lot better guides. They've got some really good 150,000 maps, which I also bought, which cover the whole of that. Either it's a walking route, a driving route, and a cycling route that covers that German bit, which is really excellent.
Well, then in that case, I'm going to have to jot down that link, and when I next go and visit the in-laws, I'll make sure I squeeze that in while we're there. Because
looking at it, looking at lunchtime, I think the volume 1 of that route is actually unavailable at the moment. I don't know if it's out of print, but there's one that goes as far as Xanten. So there is another alternative one that covers the first bit down to the German border.
Although I fear to mention it to my other half with intrepidation, because I'm only just getting over doing the Hadrian's Wall one over the weekend. So
yeah,
you may notice I'm quite sat down quite gingerly.
Yeah, well, I ducked out of some of the German bits because it was that heat wave, and I'm not the fittest of cyclists. And I was on a bike with a lot of camping gear, and I looked at these hills and thought, no, and I stuck to the Rhine to go. So I used the Rhine frontier rather than the hilly bits. I cheated, but that option is in that guide that I sent you a link for. I can send the link to the rest of people if I can probably copy it and put it in.
I think people would like to see that, and definitely I would entertain the fact that, carrying on from Gary's work, if you wanted to, people are working hard on the Antonine Wall to try and cobble together between various paths that already exist a route across the Antonine Wall, and then there is options certainly in the German area to do the footpath along the German Limes. And we have the links for that on the Hadrian's Wall website. So if you wanted to extend your walk,
Yeah, the outline one has quite a lot of gaps in it. I mean, the bits that you can walk along are really excellent. I was trying to walk all the frontiers, working from Scotland down towards the Black Sea, but I haven't done all the. I've left some of the gaps in the outline wall still. I have to go back and do them again. I also worked out a route to walk the gas bridge, or cycle the gas bridge, which is the first frontier, which is actually older than the limit zone. So.
Yeah, right. So we all know where to go if we want information on exploring the frontier by wheel or by foot. In that.
Well, I've done both. Some of them I've used whatever's appropriate for whichever section. So it's
Rob, you noticed the same thing that I noticed when Gary came on, that he is in full countryside facial hair mode. Definitely.
Yeah. I haven't seen him for a while to meet. I've sent him in reports in, John, but I haven't seen him for a while. So I had a double take when he came on. I didn't recognise him.
I think he's been doubling it as Father Christmas for to earn a few quid over the seasonal period, don't you think? That or he's gone a bit feral. That's possibly. Quite an impressive beard, Gaza. Quite an impressive beard, sir. Were there any others? David, you mentioned the German Niemeistrasse. Definitely, that's something that we should look for a link for, so that everybody can have a look at that and see how we can extend the experience that is Hadrian's Wall. Lee is saying, many thanks, Gary. How much of the path is currently inaccessible due to storms? I was up there at the end of January walking the dog, and the damage was heartbreaking. Yes, Lee, I was out as well in January, and it's unbelievable. Like I don't know what hit it, like a mighty fist hit the trail, isn't it? And knocked all those trees over. Gary, what's the current state of play?
The state of play would be that until you get to Stanley, there is nothing impeding your journey. You'll have to take the Stanley diversion is just going to run to the south of the wood and then emerge where that little lay-by is. Then you would probably have a little difficulty getting through the woods just going down Brunton Bank. The next issue would be the woods at Sowing Shields, but there's like a diversion through the woods that you can get around everything. But Cragloff as well is going to have a temporary diversion put in place onto the lower route until that one can get opened. After that, I think you'd have to go to Coombe Crag over in Cumbria. And again, there's a little bit of damage, but it's not as significant as the ones that I showed in the pictures. So probably 3 or 4 places that you can't get through, but only 2 are going to have temporary diversions.
Gary, during the conversation, you used the word SMC. Can you explain what SMC is and how it affects your work?
SMC is a scheduled monument consent. So because the monument is protected by law, I can't just go and dig in the monument. But if something broke and it's already in there, I need to be able to repair it. So what we do is we work within the guidelines of the SMC, and we created a document called the generic consent. And there's 4 levels of consent, one of them being cutting the grass is the very first, or raking molehills, things on the surface. The second level of consent is replacing structures on a like-for-like basis. So basically, if you're just doing a little bit of work that's actually just replacing what's broken with something that's just going to be identical, I'm allowed to do that. You can get up to level 3, where you start talking a little bit more substantial. And then the example of the LER, there's a lot of work to be done there. That would be a level 4 consent. The 1, 2 and 3s I'm allowed to undertake, and I just need to record everything that I do and work within the guidelines that it sets down. Level 4 is something that you would apply for that specific project. In the previous talk we did, at the end of it, I just showed you a few of the folders and things that we have to keep intact. But basically, everything within the monument is protected by law, and therefore anything that damages the monument, which can be all sorts of things, is a big no-no. So that's why we use SMC.
We've got a comment from somebody called Kerry Shaw. I've no idea who she is, but she apparently wants to know if anyone on the call would like to get involved as a volunteer managing the trail, and if so, what should they do, Gary?
Contact Kerry. There's a couple of options that we use. We use a big group of volunteers who have their individual sections. Some of the sections are volunteerless as well at the moment, but they look after and then report in anything to do with the structures and surfaces that needs work and maintain it and manage it on our behalf. And then we work with other organisations like Kerry's group or the uni, and we can do bigger activities. We're planning to do some gorse cutting at some point near Stanley, hopefully in this month. We're in March now, aren't we? And then we also get approached in other guises. And what I found is that because you travel so much, it's very hard to have day volunteers because you don't necessarily go where you think you're going to go that day. So if you're going to plan on having volunteers in Northumberland and then something happens and you have to go to Cumbria, it doesn't always work. So what we try to do is create day activities where we can focus everybody in one location rather than spreading them out. So instead of, say, having 30 volunteers in a month, it might be better to have 2 days of 15 volunteers.
Okay, thanks for that, Gary. Lee, I think you mentioned this the other day as well, didn't you? You asked about this a while ago, contacting Dave Richardson at the National Park, who's the volunteer coordinator with those guys. Maybe that's a conversation that Kerry might be able to have in one of your volunteer coordinator meetings at some point. Kerry, is that possible? And she's obviously got, yeah, look, there you go. She's just slumped across the computer with not enough ibuprofen in the system at this moment in time. That's what you've got there. So we'll wait for her to recover and come back to us. Gary, I know that you would rather be doing something than talking about doing something. So I'm very grateful for the time that you give us to come and talk, but it's incredibly practical to get your intimate knowledge of the National Trail out here, out to a wider audience. While we've got Gary, and I tell you, literally he has to be taped to a chair for him to sit there this long before he wants to go and dig something up or put a finger post in. Are there any comments or observations that people have made while being out on the trail that you just want to check with him? Because out of all the people that you can ask, this is the best person to ask right now. So if there is a trail related comment that you want to make or just observation, I recommend that you just ask Gary while he's here, and I'm sure he'll be able to answer it. Is there any others? Jane?
Yeah, so obviously, Gary, it's our 1900th anniversary year this year, and there's a lot of events. And last night I was at North Tyneside Council. Bill Griffiths was doing a presentation to the councillors about the 1900, and there was a whole part of his presentation about the numbers of people who are going to be walking the National Trail this year for their own charity fundraising projects, and he put up examples on the slide. And I was observing that last night, and then I'm observing your talk today, Gary, about the damage from the various storms. Do you feel sometimes worried when you wake up in the morning and hear the weather forecast? You know, we've had the storms at the beginning of the year, happens to coincide with our 1900th anniversary, the two things you cannot stop. How do you feel? I mean, you see, you're such a positive person. You're such a person to me who just deals with things very pragmatically, very professionally. I mean, would you prefer there to be a year when, after all the storm damage, you know, there wasn't lots of people doing charity walks along your trail?
I think as I've got older, I've kind of become more easygoing. And if we just look back at the talk we've just done, even though I mean, Desmond was horrific in the level of damage, but it's gone. The damage is gone, but what's been left is better. And so you kind of just think, well, yeah, it's not great, but working with the organisations that we do and having that input when these things happen, we end up with something that's better. And so it's kind of like, it's not great, but then you can make something good out of it. So I don't mind, actually. You know, it is what it is, and you just deal with it. And, you know, if you can make a good mark, then that's all I'm really bothered about.
David's put something in the chat, and it's like a very much a view from a long view in that sort of sense. It's very encouraging to hear how the management of the trail has moved forward to a whole new level from where it was a few years ago. Well done to all concerned. David, that is very, very true. They are working on equally limited resources. The in fact, the resources really haven't changed that much, the same for all of the management side of things. I put it down to the very strong can-do nature that is in the trail partnership at this moment in time. And Gary, at the very point of that, being a very sort of practical person and just getting on with it and moving forward with things that can be done, thinking about things in the long term. And I know that Gary's explained his 5-year cycle, sort of about how he does work and thinks about how long that will last. And he doesn't have to come back to that for 5 years rather than going over and over and over and over. So I think you're looking at a person which has changed that attitude and moved forward, and he's doing what they can with what they have is probably the best way to explain that. So a definite step change in attitude as much as anything else in that sense. Yeah, Graham, you're just echoing that, and congratulations to him, definitely. He's a one-man army, is Gary Pickles, and he gets half support during the summer with his trail assistant. What's their true title, Gary? Your
It's the National Trail Assistant, but when you say that, people dismiss them almost straight away, and then everything's directed to me and things. So I insist that they call themselves the National Trail Ranger as well.
Yep. Well, I've stood there and watched how much they watch you. So they are listening and learning over the period that they're there with you, and that's exactly what they're there to do, isn't it? To use that as a springboard to go on to other work and to get other jobs.
And actually, they start next week.
There you go. So there we go. We're up by an extra pair of hands. So you'll see 2 people with their bums in the air digging a hole somewhere along the trail at some point on its 80-odd miles. Desmond and the other storms that have come since have just reminded me about the fact that every time we have one of these climatic events, we always jump around and go, oh my goodness, what's happened? And every time we've been incredibly lucky. I don't know whether you agree, Gary, in terms of damage really to the monument itself. We've been, given the scale of some of these natural disasters, in effect, we've been incredibly lucky not to be more impacted than we really have been. And actually the other day it occurred to me that in a way the Romans had their pick of the best real estate along this area. So, you know, they've chosen the highest ground, they've chosen the strongest ground, they've chosen the bit that's out of the way. So, you know, in a way it shouldn't really be a surprise because they picked the best because they could when they set out their monument in the first place. So yeah, Storm Desmond, pretty much every part of the wall was kind of above the water as it went through. When the winds came, we were incredibly lucky that they came the wrong way for the trees, but the right way for the wall and the monument in some respects. And we lost a few facing stones in certain places, but that was it. It could have been so much worse. So somebody is smiling down on us, evidently. Well, you've added, I think one of the great things that I found about walking the trail is it took me to the eastern and western ends that aren't travelled so much as the honey spot section, definitely in the middle, which I've done many times before. Gary, some of the funding that you get is related to the average number of something like 12,000 walkers per year walking the trail from end to end, and that's how all National Trails funding is worked out. That's probably a fair statement of who's walking either end. But in the central sector that Bill's referring to, you probably get 12,000 people in a week over the summer holidays. So it's a bit of an unfair sort of calculation in a way, because it's kind of working out those 2 extreme east and west ends. They're the ones that have got 12,000 people walking the National Trail every year. In the middle, it's anywhere between 1 and 3 million in that sort of sense. So yeah, absolutely an observation there, Bill. Rob, Gary, what is the latest thinking on the Steel Rig to Sycamore Gap section, where we know the trail is increasingly worn with the increase in visitor figures in the last 2 years? Gary, have a got that, and I'll chip in at the end if you want.
No, it's good. I'll pick up the bit that you just mentioned previously. One of the things that I've kind of wanted to do for a long time is as the trail exists over a period of time, things are done upon it, but generally in the past they were done individually. So we've got a lot of people counters, but none of them really relate very well to each other and things. And so I did think it would be quite a useful thing that if you could get people counters in the areas that pretty much are only going to be trail walkers, and then have the same ones running through the busier sections, you can actually get some better figures for what levels of usage they are and things. I think that's one of the things. I think Newcastle Uni we were looking at something with them, and if we can get the same type put in, because a lot of it was like the old ones, the software didn't work with current technologies and things. So that's something that we're going to look forward to doing in the future. And then picking up the section steel rigged. What I would hope, because it is getting quite badly damaged, is that if we can demonstrate through the work of top dressing and the work that we're going to do on cat stairs that I briefly touched on with the LEI, then the LEI isn't just a one-off thing. If we can develop something, we can develop it with the funders and with Historic England for what we're allowed to do. We then may be able to demonstrate how something that we've done in one place would work in another. And I think it would need something like that, something more significant than sort of managing it on a small scale. So I'm thinking if we can get some work undertaken and demonstrate how it has created a sustainable feature that fits well within the landscape, we then would be able to go to them and say, can we do that again?
I want to add to that, Rob, as well, that I think the last 2 years, as you specify, have seen an increase in visitor figures to that particular section. There's been a reason for that in the shape of COVID, it's been a stress test in every sense of the word stress test. I think the sites have seen a drop dramatically, but I think that if you look at the car park figures for the national park, from the beginning of COVID onwards, they've been 200% up. Because people are wanting fresh air, open space, wanting to get away from it. So they've all been getting away from it in the same place. So we're seeing an artificial ballooning of figures over that particular 2-year period. I'm hoping that some of those people are converted to spending time in the countryside, but we won't retain all of them. So I think we're seeing a blip on the graph. We're learning a lot of lessons over 2 years about what stress looks like on the national trail in that particular area, but the water will find its own level after a period of time as well. So there's two things going on there, I think.
Yeah, thanks, John. The other thing I would say is Gary mentioned there having people counters in. Well, we did some work pre-COVID for Gary Ed Hudspah, as his name, Ed? Ed, the technical, didn't we? And we sort of put, I don't know, monitors in our rucksacks and walk certain bits to see whether whatever he got to pick the signal up, and that was an idea of counting people and on long sections of the trail. So I don't know what actually happened to that bit of work, you know.
I think there's a lot of good ideas that go on with a lot of people and things, and I think it's trying to make sure that, you know, they're all talking the same or communicating well with each other, and then we can just tie it up. Because you can get really good data, but you can also get really bad data from the same tool. So it's just actually, or is that data relevant in any way, as it were? So, you know, you can get steel rig and you might find out that it's really heavily used. Well,
Jane, I noticed you were unmuted, and we've been talking about data repeatedly over the last year and a half at least.
Absolutely. I mean, we're at the point now with in our work the phase that we're in at the moment on Hadrian's Wall is called our 10-year investment plan. And falling out tactically underneath that major strategy, tactically there are funding streams which are becoming available. Capital, largely capital as ever, revenue's really hard to find, but capital schemes. And walking and cycling is a really, really main feature of the funding thrust. So actually, in order to draw down that money from government, we do have to provide data. So actually, this is the time, Gary and Rob and Bill, everybody who is, you know, who is involved in the trail as a volunteer or as having your own individual bits. This is the year, certainly this year, next year, where we are actually going to have to invest in counting methodology, because we're going to have to prove to government that we've used their money to attract more visitors. And obviously sustainability is key to this. So we would never write a funding proposal that said, could everybody please just go to Sycamore Gap every Sunday, and that's the only place we're going to promote. As I think I've said before on these talks, if you're a member of the partnership board, you do not use Sycamore Gap in your imagery. You do not talk about it, because we know that Sycamore Gap can look after itself in visitor terms. What we're really interested in is what Bill was talking about, you know, the eastern end, the western end, and getting people out of the main sites. But the evidence that you give, Gary, Rob, Bill, everybody who's on this call, the evidence that you give will really help us to buy in the right data. And as John says, we talk about this often, but actually we're going to have to land this now. What are those things that people who do fitness, you know, I mean, I do my Apple Watch, but you know, when you have a route that you add to cyclists apps and to walkers apps.
So we're looking at Strava data and stuff.
That's right, Strava data. You can tell that I'm not a fitness person, otherwise I'd know the name. But things like that, it may be, you know, that we piggyback and buy their data, buy other people's data. But actually, we're just going to take your word for it, Gary. There's no point. We're not going to put a study out there where somebody with a clipboard says, "Oh, what could we use?" when we've got all this knowledge in the Wall family. So we're going to have to land this though, John, because I don't want a future conference for us to have not solved this, because now is the time, because there's capital available to do precisely this. So Gary, you know, we'll be ringing you up soon.
Good.
Absolutely, we have conversations, guys, about the fact that there's so much data on Hadrian's Wall. I can tell you within a gnats of who visited which site, when, and whatever. But that's 11 museums along a long length of monument. So it's 11 pinpricks. You know that you can access Hadrian's Wall 24/7 anytime you like without passing a pay gate at any particular point. You can visit it off the A69, you can visit it on the West Road, you can visit it at Steel Rig and so forth. We spend the time when we're trying to figure that data doing a great impression of Donald Rumsfeld going, there are known unknowns and all this sort of stuff, because we've got to try and find ways of capturing that amount of interaction with Hadrian's Wall that just doesn't exist at this moment in time. So we're looking at train data, bus data, Strava data, any data that you can possibly get your hands on. And at some point, Catherine's going to talk about GIS later this evening. And if we can bring all that data into one place, Catherine, imagine how powerful a tool that would be. Looking at what you were just saying, Rob, it's car park data in the national park, looking who's using that car park and when and where and all that sort of stuff. And ultimately, that's where I'd like the GIS to take us, into a place where we could park all that data and we could draw conclusions, and those unknown knowns, or those known unknowns, become trends at the very least that we can understand. Because I can't go around guessing and telling you that the visitor figures to Hadrian's Wall total is somewhere between 1 million and 3 million, because that's quite a big pool. You know what I mean? But I have no idea, because I don't count everybody that's at Steel Rig on a given August Sunday. And it's a lot of people in that sort of sense. Catherine, is that sort of an ultimate GIS dream, or is that somewhere that we can go at some point?
Yeah, I think like what I'm working on right now is going to create a really good basis for a lot of things, because it's just bringing together all of the information that we have about the feature and the monument itself and all of its different bits. But then it'll be available to anyone and everyone who wants to use it. So they'll be able to take that and add their own data to it. And either they can do research, or like what you're talking about, look at impacts on the wall and how it's being used and all sorts of things like that. So I think it's going to go beyond sort of academic knowledge, and it's going to have a real impact on how we can manage the monument. So.
Absolutely. If we could find out that one particular bus stop led to erosion in one particular area, and if we moved that bus stop a little bit further along, or made there 2 bus stops so that we could do it, you know, just by amalgamating all that data into one visual place, how great would that be, Gary, that we could use that sort of stuff? You know what I mean? Yep. What's the interaction between all the different effectors on Hadrian's Wall, and how does that work?